How long can Russia keep up its fight in Ukraine? More analysis is revealing the scale of Russian casualties, and they're pretty staggering. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's dig in to Russia's growing casualty numbers. This is from the New York Times, and there's a rule in journalism that says that if a headline is a question, the answer is no. It's saying, is its army depleted? The answer is almost certainly no. Now, they talk a lot about the fact that there's the math of the calculus of losses and casualties is pretty tough, right? Because not all losses are created equal. This is why when you look at the total number of deaths and injuries, which are usually summed up as casualties, they can mean a lot of things. We've talked about that extensively on this channel. For example, again, lightly wounded soldiers may be returned to the battlefield in a few days, whereas heavily wounded soldiers are sort of permanently sent home. And it's tough to know, right? This, to say casualties is everything from a soldier who gets a piece of shrapnel scraping their shoulder, all the way to someone with severe brain damage who's functionally a vegetable for the rest of their life. And so the fact that there's a category that includes both of those things makes it tough to assess what it means when you have these tremendously high casualty numbers. In fact, you may observe that having a shrapnel wound considering you a casualty could actually mean that the same soldier could be a casualty 3 or 4 times, particularly if they're wounded, and then killed, right? You might end up with, again, a soldier who's listed 3 times on a casualty number. But there are other calculations that are actually done that are pretty innovative by Russian opposition media outlets. And they show that Russia's army has lost more soldiers in this war than any industrialized nation in any conflict since the Second World War. So again, this is one of those things where I think it's interesting. There's a lot of people who hand-wring about, oh, is this World War III? We're close to World War III. And it's like, as far as Russia's concerned, this is World War III, at least in terms of casualty numbers. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at Mediazona, they rely on a couple of things. First off, they try to find obituaries and cemetery burials, right? This is Mediazona who's figuring out. And using that metric, they find about 80,000 dead Russian soldiers. These are Russian citizens, not Ukrainian separatists or foreign fighters who, again, are going to be buried elsewhere, right? Of course, a similar methodology of Ukraine's losses actually put their losses at 65,000. So much closer than a lot of people initially might be thinking. Now, the Mediazona acknowledges that some soldiers are simply untraceable. Their deaths are never publicly acknowledged. In fact, there's a lot of families based on kind of the leaked social media posts that we've gotten that the families of these soldiers, oftentimes, the official Russian military stance is missing in action. And missing in action means that you can't run an inheritance. You can't run a funeral, right? Their bodies. Russia doesn't know officially that they were even in Ukraine. And Russia has a pretty large incentive to list soldiers as missing in action because there's death payments that come with being officially killed. And again, Mediazona also helps infer the war dead using a public notary database, which includes inheritance cases opened by the relatives of dead soldiers, right? And so this is likely going to capture more of those missing soldiers because after a time where the soldier is kind of out of touch, the family may say, listen, we want to start an inheritance case for him in order to formally declare him dead and inherit his goods. So this is something, again, they also use kind of the pandemic where there's really good data about deaths to inheritance sort of ratios and how many military-age Russian men became the subject of inheritance proceedings since the start of the invasion. And this gives the journalist estimate of about 150,000 dead, which is, I think, more accurate and aligns pretty perfectly with the Western estimates and even pretty close to Ukrainian public estimates of Russian dead, right? And when they look at wounded, they are often looking at they're trying to figure out severe battlefield injuries. So they look at personnel list and statistics on veterans' compensation payments. Again, lightly wounded veterans who are returned to duty, unlikely to draw large compensation payments, whereas the severely wounded soldiers are going to draw these kind of veterans benefits. Again, it's similar to the U.S., where lightly wounded soldiers are treated and returned to duty and never leave the Department of Defense, whereas heavily wounded soldiers are discharged eventually and become the responsibility of the Department of Veterans Affairs. So you could literally figure it out if you could get the enrollment data for both of those entities. That's sort of what they appear to have done here. And they say that for every dead Russian soldier, about 2 more are seriously injured and injured enough to be removed from the fight permanently, right? It's a rough approximation. And again, this, as the weapons, medical equipment, and tactics change, so do the casualty numbers, right? Russia is believed to have suffered about 400,000 irreplaceable losses. Right? BBC puts it about 500,000 irreplaceable losses. And that's about right. Because again, you assume that it's totally reasonable to say that if you have about 200,000 irreplaceable losses, you may have about another 200,000 sort of casualty, like lower grade casualties where soldiers are returned to duty, putting that 700,000 estimate actually spot on. So now, again, this is something where 600,000 to 700,000 dead and wounded seems about right. Again, and these internal estimates include light injuries of soldiers returned to duty. Now, here's the thing. The other catch about determining the depletion of the Russian military is inputs. And before we talk about that, I want to mention that if you're feeling a little depleted, you may not need to, recruit a bunch of drunks from rural areas of Russia. You may just need a little extra caffeine. Now, Strike Gum is the energy drink alternative. If you're tired of spending $5 for a can of Monster, getting a ton of sugar, and having to frankly carry around the most inconvenient form of caffeine ever invented, you want to switch to Strike Gum, right? There's no reason, guys. It's not 2006 anymore. You don't need to be drinking Monster or Red Bull or whatever trashy energy drink they've got out there. Strike Gum is just superior. Each individual piece of Strike Gum contains 90 milligrams of caffeine, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, and 0 sugar. So if you're looking to, bring your energy into 2024, you want to go to strikegum.com or go to Amazon and search for Strike Gum. Links in the description. Okay. So here's the thing. In Russia, they have about 33 million men eligible for military service and about 6 million men eligible for military service in Ukraine before Russia's invasion. Some of those 6 million have likely fled, right? And about half of them have been registered in the country's military database. So Ukraine has a pool of about 3 million soldiers, less than a tenth of Russia's total pool. Again, and as they point out, about 900 men joined Russia for every day in the first half of the year, putting Russia's force generation capabilities at about 25,000 troops every single month, which is a crazy number, right? Ukraine, in turn, is generating about 6,000 to 8,000 troops. But there's more problems here, and this is the point. Russia is bigger, but that's been the case since day one. The reason Russia hasn't won is because Russia is in a war of choice, whereas Ukraine is in a war of survival. And so while Russia does not have a draft, Ukraine does, right? And Russia is currently having to pay a lot of money into soldiers to recruit soldiers, right? And again, as they point out, at this point, the bonuses are so high that they are changing the financial futures of the recruit's family, regardless of whether they live or die, right? It's also, of course, the Kremlin's also bringing in fighters from developing nations. They use the word volunteers, but essentially, again, imagine if you are paying so much that rural Russians are signing up, in droves to basically face certain death, you can imagine how enthused someone like a Somali or a Congolese man would feel if they were offered that level of salary to fight for Russia. Again, it's going to change their family or likely even their extended family's entire lives to make $50,000, which is, or $25,000, which is the range that you're seeing for a soldier who, again, joins, fights, and dies. And of course, that doesn't include North Korea, whose troops are Russia is still likely paying heavily for those troops, but it seems like Russia is maybe paying in technology, in high-tech military gear, and also in experts, right? It seems as though North Korea is receiving a lot of rocket development expertise from Russia. So again, Russia's still paying, but much cheaper than the rubles it has to give to these families. The other problem, and I want to point out, is that Russia's loss rates are accelerating. In October, the daily loss rate was about 1,350 per day. This is according to Ukrainian General Staff, but it's vetted by the UK's Defense Intelligence Agency. Right, Russia in October 24 believed to have lost about 41,000 troops, a high over the 39,000 previous amount. So again, what you're seeing here is likely Russia stepping up its operations because in addition to the 25,000 troops it gets every month from its recruitment efforts, it's likely also received, again, 10,000 additional North Korean troops with a larger number coming through the pipeline, likely up to 100,000. And so that combined with the fact that in winter operations are going to likely slow somewhat as days get shorter, Russia may be trying to surge now, before there's a kind of lull in the fighting in the winter. Of course, right now, neither side wants to give the other one a break. They want to keep attriting Ukrainian and Russian force. They want to keep grinding each other, never stopping, never allowing the other to sort of really rest and refit. But here's the other thing that I think is important to talk about, and that is that Ukrainian public is behind the war. They want to see, by and large, their country survive, right? Their country continue to exist. And Russia, in turn, this is a war of choice, right? It's not existential. It is not Russia fighting for its survival. And the difference is pretty clear in terms of motivation. When you have this war of survival, you have your country and the citizenry is more likely to go all in and really try to help and see the war won. Whereas the Russian public may eventually tire of these level of casualties. While it's easy to inflict casualties on sort of disconnected, poor rural Russians, there's a limit to how many losses a country can take. And the Ukrainians are also willing to be subject to growing inflation, a struggling economy, right? This is a standard kind of war economy stuff. But the Russian public, they are not fighting a war of survival. So when their prices rise, when more and more of their neighbors and friends and family are dead, when there's more and more of a labor shortage, it's going to become a greater and greater problem politically for someone like Putin. Again, dictators stay in power. They don't stay in power because, like in the US, right, when things aren't working for regular people, they can vote a new party into power. That's not the case with a dictator. You have to but when things are bad enough and the public doesn't support a dictator, they're going to get them out of power one way or another, right? And that's sort of the fear I think Putin has, is that he has to make sure his economy remains kind of in balance, right? It can't subject Russian citizens to a turbo super war economy because this isn't an existential war. So what you see is Russia performatively sometimes going after some of their commanders. For example, Russia claims that it's going after, quote, butcher commanders. Brigade commanders of 3 brigades have been dismissed and arrested, allegedly because of tactics that produce high unnecessary losses, where the personnel were sent on meat grinder assaults. Now, This is believed to be kind of made up now, and is more likely the fact that these commanders probably no longer had the trust and confidence of the Kremlin. They may have been believed to have been conspiring against the Kremlin, is one rumor. And the Kremlin, though, never is going to not use this sort of thing for a propaganda point. And it's interesting that the Kremlin's propaganda point is to say, hey, we're actually mad. We don't deny that there's these meat assaults that produce tremendous casualties, but we're going to pretend that these were one-off or three-off rogue commanders kind of going off on their own and doing this, which is really interesting because it's a tacit acknowledgement by the Kremlin that casualties are insanely high, that these soldiers are being ground down in pointless assaults, and that the Russian public is fully aware of it on some level. That's the part that's interesting to me about all this. Anyway, guys, that's really all I had. Huge thank you to the Colonel tier members like Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gortz, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys, and I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.